This all starts with the creator of Serum, Steve Duda. Steve was friends with Deadmau5 way before they were famous, and as you'll see, the way they talk about kicks is almost identical. So I think we can learn a lot about the Deadmau5 kick philosophy by studying Steve Duda. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a bit of an upgraded way of thinking about kicks and a better understanding of why Deadmau5 likes shorter kicks. Thank you to PYRAMIND for the original footage. Don't lose sight of the big picture. Before we get into kicks, remember we're making songs, not kicks. So find a good kick, but don't get lost in it.
Joel's taught me a lot about just, you hear something, you go for it, and when it's close, you move on to another facet. You don't like obsess over this one detail, because if you obsess over this one detail, you're gonna lose the big picture. The more that the music comes from within you and the more that you know what you're going for, the easier it is to find it.
Have an artistic vision. Part of staying focused on the big picture is having a clear artistic vision, not just for the macro, but for the micro as well. So a vision for the entire song and a vision for each building block, like a kick.
He had some really weird things that he did that I had never seen people do before. One of them was just to fly through samples. I mean, like if we were looking for a kick drum, it was just next, like, and then boom, and just one, why that one? Like, dude. It took me a while like to realize, like, in his head he already knew the sound of the kick drum that he wanted, and he just was waiting to find the one that was close enough of a match. And when he found one that was close, yep, okay, that'll do. And then you're done with the kick drum. Now we're on to the next thing.
Create space. If your song is 120 beats per minute, that means each quarter note is 500 milliseconds. So if those are the limits, you have to figure out what you want to prioritize within those 500 milliseconds. A great question to ask is, what can I afford to get rid of?
But one of my big mix tricks is creating space. And one way to create space is, of course, with time. That's one of our big dimensions, right? So if you can shorten sounds, the more you're going to create space for the next sound to be interesting. So I'm almost always shortening sounds because people want things as big as possible. And you solo a kick drum, you're going to favor the long kick drum, but in the context of having this busy bass part and stuff like that, the big kick drum is no longer very valuable. And I think about this way in a lot of different scenarios with mixing music. What can I afford to get rid of? In other words, they can't all be loud. Certain things are going to have to be quiet, which will make the other ones that are loud feel even louder.
There's a lot of engineering tricks you can learn to make things sound a little more glued together than shit just stacked up on top of shit. You know what I mean? Like, and just adding until you can't add anymore and you're distorting.
Waves of bass. One of the main points from my viral Deadmau5 video was to create short, transient kicks. Why? To leave space for the bass, because you can't have big without small. I think this is the main idea behind why Deadmau5 likes short kicks. They serve a purpose. It's all about contrast, yin, yang, or as Steve Duda says, bass waves.
Time, right? How do I want the low end to happen over time? Imagine yourself sitting on the subwoofer or in the club, in the sweet spot of it all with the best sound system known to mankind, right? How do I want this low end to shake my ribcage? What do I want to have happen? Do I want waves of bass? If I want waves of bass, that means there needs to be these moments without bass in order for the wave to happen. So this is why I'm shortening my kick drums, like I said earlier, all the time, because I want to hit people with this wave of low frequencies, but I don't want it to always be there. Clarity is, it's what you don't hear more than what you hear that makes something clear. It's the absence of junk.
The story behind the Deadmau5 short kick all comes back to a night at a club with Steve Duda. I don't want to ruin the story, but it's crazy because you can hear them both describe the experience in almost the exact same words.
It reminds me of early on when Deadmau5 was starting to just get into his rhythm, and he had done this track with Melly Fresh called Hey Baby. I think that was the track. It was one of the ones with her early on. And I was at a club called Pasha in New York, which is a great sound system. And then his track came on, and all of a sudden, it sounded really bad, really, because it was like, it was just this wall of low end. Instead of this like, ooh, 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 all of a sudden you heard this, ooh, ooh, ooh. And I didn't like that experience. And I even told him about it. I was like, dude, your kick drum's too long in that track, I think, because it's like a standing wave, right? It's just this constant hum, and nothing's exciting anymore.
If you were to play this in a club or a big system, you would just hear 30 hertz across the fucking board. You'd hear nothing else. It would just be like...
Less bass can be good. It's important to remember that your nice headphones are not the same as the club listening system. So as much as we like to obsess over gear, it's important to think about where your track will be played. If you're making dance music, that's clubs. And those clubs do not have perfect room acoustics.
So that was a learning experience of where, like, yeah, you keep your kick drum short because even though his track sounded fine on headphones or in a smaller room, once you're in a big club, what happens? Well, these subs hype the low end usually, and there's propagation of this wave is going to go from, if I'm the speaker, over to you. There's going to be this wave, but it's also going to bounce off these walls, and it's going to exist for longer than it existed in your audio file, right? As the reverb from the low frequencies are casting out. So even if you have a short kick drum, say an eighth note, half the time, right? If you have an eighth note kick drum, you might be hearing that kick drum for almost up to the quarter note with this reverberation, depending on how big the space is. Yeah, keeping your kick drum short actually allows the next kick drum event to be exciting again.
I find that the better tracks have actually shorter kicks because they're using low-end frequencies on synths and stuff.
Genre matters. You know, so if you're wondering how long should the kick be, just listen to other songs in your genre that you like, because every genre needs different things.
I mean, my rule of thumb with it is to first assess the song and the musical situation, because I don't like rules that are just going to be something that's always for all music and all genres, right? So my thesis or rule would be that you can have a big kick drum or you can have a big bass sound, but you can't have both, at least happening simultaneously. My kind of vague rule of thumb would be if it's a house track, like I said earlier, you can have a kick drum that's big or a bass that's big, but not both. Dubstep is kind of the opposite, right? With dubstep, you want this big bass that's just like, whoa, this massive thing's like overwhelming you and it's like moving, and you're really getting this low end from the bass instrument. The kick drum, not so much. It's not necessary to be like, boom. It doesn't need to do that.
Faking loudness. So much just comes back to perception. This is actually a lot like the contrast tip from before.
In both these genres of music, nobody wants a small bass sound, right? No one wants a small kick drum. So there's techniques you can use that are psychoacoustic, essentially, ways that you can give the effect and impression of something being big without actually being big in the low frequencies. So an example for like a kick with dubstep would be a lot of verb. And sure enough, that's what a lot of people do with their kicks in dubstep, right? This big hall reverb on it. It doesn't have to be this low end that's like really rumbly to experience what you picture as a big kick drum. And it's such an effective technique, especially if your track starts with the kick, the bass hasn't come in yet. The brain calibrates itself to this kick drum as that's a big low-end instrument, right? Because boom, boom, and it has this big hall. Then the actual bass sound comes in with real low frequencies, and you go, holy fuck, how did they get such a big bass sound? And it's like, well, it's not the bass sound isn't necessarily that big. If you heard it soloed, it would be a massive preset or whatever. It's not necessarily that big. It's the fact that you got in tune to what you thought a big bass sound was when you were actually starved of low frequencies. And then now when you actually hear something, it's like drinking after being in the desert or something. It's like, whoa, okay, I like that.
Hit down.